Hello, everyone. Welcome to my summary of personal jurisdiction. If you're in a civil procedure class and you're getting ready to take your final exam, or you just want to know more about personal jurisdiction, then this video is for you. I'm going to give you the roadmap of personal jurisdiction analysis. I will leave some things out, but I will give you a great general idea of how it works in practice, how the analysis would go on a final exam. So, what is personal jurisdiction? It's what a court needs to hear a case. They will have it over the defendant, and they need it to hail the defendant into court. So, there are multiple ways in which a court can have personal jurisdiction over a defendant. First, courts can have general jurisdiction over a defendant, meaning that the court can exercise jurisdiction over all claims against the defendant, regardless of whether or not those claims are related to the defendant's contacts with the forum state. So what does this look like? Well, a court has general jurisdiction over a corporate defendant when the defendant has a principal place of business or is incorporated in the forum state and has systematic and continuous contacts with the state. We get this from, among other cases, the Supreme Court's decision in Daimler. And then, of course, we have to talk about general jurisdiction over individual persons. A court has general jurisdiction over an individual when the individual is domiciled in the state, meaning that they currently reside there and have intent to remain there. You might recall that this is similar for domicile in a diversity case when we're trying to determine whether someone is a member or a citizen, a resident of a certain state. So if a court doesn't have specific jurisdiction or general jurisdiction, they can also have specific jurisdiction. And here we have a longer analysis. It's going to start with long-arm statutes. So first, they need a statutory basis to exercise personal jurisdiction. This comes from a long-arm statute that was passed by the state legislature. A long-arm statute's text may authorize jurisdiction to the limits of the Constitution, and in that case, the court would move on to analyze whether specific jurisdiction over the claim would be constitutional. This is because the statute is basically saying, well, it depends on what the Constitution says. So there are other cases, though, other long-arm statutes, which might also state that some scenarios, they lay out some scenarios where a court would have specific jurisdiction over a claim. And in that case, we need to determine whether or not the statute is unconstitutional. So the statute might say something like, we have personal jurisdiction over any defendant who has ever visited the state. That would pretty much be unconstitutional. We need to look at basically a lot of these Supreme Court cases on the 14th Amendment's due process and how it relates to personal jurisdiction. Due process requires that the defendant have minimum contacts with the forum state, and the claim must arise from these minimum contacts. We're going to get more into that later. But of course, we also have to talk about federal courts because long-arm statutes are passed at the state level. If a federal court wants to exercise personal jurisdiction, we look to Federal Rule of Civil Procedure 4K1A, which provides that a federal court can exercise jurisdiction over a defendant only if the courts of the state in which that federal jurisdiction sits can do so. The long-arm statute must still apply to the conduct in question as well. We always need to look at that. So the long-arm statute might be unconstitutional, but then it also might not even apply to the conduct, in which case the court does not even have a statutory basis for exercising specific personal jurisdiction in the first place. So pay really close attention to what the long-arm statute says. Your professor will probably give you an example of a long-arm statute to go along with the hypothetical in a final exam question. They might give you multiple, too, that you could look at. So now, having talked about the statutory analysis for specific personal jurisdiction, we're going to move on to talk about what the U.S. Constitution says, or what the Supreme Court has said the U.S. Constitution says. To satisfy the due process requirement, the court's exercise over the defendant of personal jurisdiction must comply with traditional notions of fair play and substantial justice, meaning that it must be foreseeable to the defendant that they could be hailed into court because of their contacts, and that they purposefully availed themselves of the forum state or targeted behavior toward it. We get that from Supreme Court cases like 1980's Worldwide Volkswagen versus Woodson and 1945's International Shoe Co. versus Washington. International Shoe, of course, is a massive case. You can check out my video on it, but it established the whole minimum context thing and sort of overruled a lot of the Pennoyer case. There's also the stream of commerce theory for personal jurisdiction. This is a bit more niche, but it could still come up on an exam. In a situation where a defendant's product enters a stream of commerce and causes injury in another state, the defendant merely being aware that the product could have been swept into the state does not constitute purposeful availment, as we learned from Asahi Metal Co. But if a product is sold in the forum state, then there is purposeful availment. And we get that from the Gray Radiator case. That's a really old case, like over a century old. But yeah, this is a very, very bizarre, niche, and ambiguous area of the law. There is a lot that's undecided in stream of commerce theory. Check out my Asahi Metal Co. Case summary video if you want to learn more on that. There's a plurality opinion as well as some concurrences that lay out different visions for stream of commerce. And we still kind of are waiting for the Supreme Court to just say what they think is the definitive law of the land on it. But, it's something that can come up. Then, of course, and I didn't put this first because I think it's important, but it's something that can end the personal jurisdiction analysis by basically in favor of the court having personal jurisdiction. A court can also have personal jurisdiction if the defendant consents to the personal jurisdiction or waives their objection to personal jurisdiction. One way that a defendant can do that is if they go into court and they just litigate on the merits. Because if they're litigating on the merits, they're sort of consenting to the court having personal jurisdiction and conceding that they should properly be there in the first place. But yeah, there's lastly this sort of weird concept of in rem jurisdiction, where a court can exercise this personal jurisdiction specifically over property. For a court to exercise in rem or quasi in rem jurisdiction, courts must assess the circumstances under the International Shoe Framework of minimum contacts, such that jurisdiction will comply with fair play and substantial justice. The court established this in Schaefer versus Heitner, where they said, yeah, look, international shoe applies to jurisdiction over property as well. In rem jurisdiction is jurisdiction against the property itself, while quasi in rem jurisdiction is for specific property against a specific person. So, it's a little niche. It's not something that your Civ Pro textbook likely goes into great deal on, but that's sort of the general difference. You might not be tested on it like, oh, is this a case where you should look at in rem or where you should look at quasi in rem? But that's just the distinction. Quasi in rem, this was what they were looking at in Schaefer versus Heitner, specifically in that fact pattern. For a court to exercise quasi in rem jurisdiction, the property must be sufficiently related to the lawsuit. And of course, in Schaefer, if you read that case, you may recall that the claim did not arise out of the defendant's single share of stock in Delaware. So quasi in rem jurisdiction was unconstitutional, and Delaware's statute that purported to authorize quasi in rem jurisdiction in that case was unconstitutional on its face. So yeah, that about wraps up the personal jurisdiction roadmap. You could make a flow chart out of this. It's probably the bulkiest thing in Civ Pro, along with the Erie Doctrine. I made a video on that as well. But I hope that these slides were helpful. I hope that they helped you kind of understand the way the analysis flows. Obviously, it doesn't all need to be in the order that I laid it out for you. But I think starting with general jurisdiction is generally, pun intended, a good idea. And then you move on to the specific jurisdiction analysis. You start with the long arm statute basis for specific in personam jurisdiction. And then you move on to the constitutional analysis. And then also you would look at whether or not the defendant has consented to or waived objections to personal jurisdiction. And then pay attention if there's also some property involved, where there might be in rem jurisdiction, and if the plaintiff's trying to get the court to have jurisdiction over that property. But yeah, please let me know if you have any questions. Please leave a like, comment, or subscribe to the channel if you found this helpful. I hope that you can get an A++ in your civil procedure class. I'm here for you. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to speaking to you in the next video.